Welcome back. Let's spend a few minutes thinking like an economist. So this means applying the economics framework, thinking about why economists use models, and maybe justifying why they make so many assumptions. So let's start off by thinking about the traditional scientific method. The standard scientific method is one of an observation, maybe a hypothesis, run an experiment, gather some data, and then come to some sort of conclusion about that hypothesis. But economists have a slightly different task. Theirs is slightly more challenging because they're analysts of society. So economists bring their framework, their theory, their assumptions, their worldview to questions or observations that they are trying to answer. So the economics framework is one of scarce resources and self-interested individuals, and those two combining to hopefully explain economic behavior. So how do economists go about their job? Well, they use theory or empirical models, data models, statistics, that try and understand what's going on in the world around them. But they face a challenge, and that challenge is that it's really difficult to run experiments. The federal government won't let us just randomly change government spending to see what happens, or won't let monetary policy makers just tinker around with randomly choosing interest rates to see how that changes economic behavior. Experiments are really difficult in economics. So let's think about a couple roles of economists and maybe how they approach them. So one role of an economist is to serve as an analyst of society. So for example, let's suppose that you observe gas prices are increasing. The economics question is, why? Well, it could be a story about a change in input prices, so the price of oil increasing, in which case this is the scarce resource piece of the economics framework, or it could be that it's summertime and people are out driving more. That's a story about their preferences changing, right? That self-interest side of the framework changing. The other role economists take on is that of forecaster. So suppose that Netflix is considering raising their prices. What'll happen? Will people be able to afford a subscription? That's a question about what do they do with their scarce resources. Or will customers cut other subscriptions or spending elsewhere in order to pay for their now more expensive Netflix subscription? This is a story about self-interested individuals and their preferences. So let's take this idea of scarce resources, self-interested individuals, and outcomes and think about this economics framework. So if we think about this sort of as a flow, we think about scarce resources leading the trade-offs. Well, how do people decide about those trade-offs? They do it by applying their preferences, their self-interest to the trade-off, and that leads to their economic decisions. So these two roles as analyst or forecaster are looking at the same framework just in a slightly different order. So an analyst is going to observe a decision and then they're going to research the preferences and try and figure out what led to that decision or behavior. The analyst is observing something, seeing the decision, saying, okay, what preferences led to that? What self-interest led to that outcome? Versus the forecaster is going to take the preferences and self-interest and try and use those to forecast, guess what that outcome might be. So they're just taking it in different orders. So let's dive in and think a little bit about how economists tackle these challenges. So when they're modeling society, economists are going to have to make some assumptions. Why? Well, there are millions of people. These are millions of potential buyers. These are millions of potential sellers. There are lots of different companies out there. There are lots of different input variables. There are prices of other products. This is such a big data set and sort of big problem, we're going to have to do something to simplify it. Well, a model is just a tool for thought. It helps us think about this complex world. Automobile manufacturers use clay models to get a vision of what the vehicle might look like. Economists use their models to try and get an understanding of how the world works or how it might work. So in order to make these models tractable or understandable, economists are going to have to make some assumptions in order to make these models workable and understandable. Let's take a look at why. So suppose you're looking at 3 items: apples, oranges, and strawberries. And you want to think about how the price of one affects the price of the other. So with just 3 goods, we can see we've got 6 different combinations we've got to worry about. But what if we throw in a 4th good, like strawberries? Ooh, now that's a lot more different combinations and relationships that we've got to get our mind wrapped around. But this is still only 4 goods. What if we're talking about hundreds of different fruits and vegetables? Let alone all the other different items in the grocery store. God forbid we step outside of the grocery store and start thinking about the millions of different items and all those different relationships. It's a complex world we live in. So economists make assumptions to simplify the complex world so it's more understandable. So what do their models and assumptions look like? Well, economic models come in sort of 2 different types. There's the theoretical models that use mathematical equations to try and model through relationships and gain insights. And then there are the empirical models. So the empirical models are analysis of data to identify relationships or find evidence in favor of one of those theoretical models or refute one of those theoretical models. So these are the 2 types of economists. If we think about them in terms of approaches, you have your theoretical economists and you have your empirical economists. These are 2 different sets of tools they use to approach problems. So theory models are set up on some common assumptions. So what are the assumptions that they often make in theory models? Well, it's a self-interested individual. How is somebody going to make a decision? Well, they're going to make the choice that maximizes their utility. Which decision do companies make? The one that maximizes their profits. They often assume a representative agent. So this means an individual that represents a population. They often simplify to thinking about 2 goods. Because if you're thinking about trade-offs, maybe you don't need to model 100 different goods. Just look at 2 of them to help think about those trade-offs. And rather than using clay models, economic models often look like graphs, have lines on them, arrows, etc. You'll see a lot more of those in other videos. Now, what about empirical models? So empirical models are using data and statistical analysis. The difficulty with empirical models is that it's hard to run experiments in economics. So where does your data come from? Economists often use existing data to try and make inference. But the difficulty of using existing data is maybe it's hard to tease out is what we're seeing causation or correlation. So for example, there are more shark attacks around the times when ice cream sales are highest. Oh, well maybe the way to end shark attacks is to cut off ice cream sales. I don't think so. This isn't a story about causation, it's a story about correlation. What causes both of those? It's summertime. During the summer, people buy more ice cream and there are more shark attacks. So it's sometimes hard to tease out what's causing what. So to try and get around this problem, economists look for natural experiments. These are events that take place in the world that act almost as if it was a planned experiment. So an example from Wilmington, North Carolina, is pollution in the water. So economists are trying to figure out how much do people value clean water when making a decision about how much to pay for a house. Wilmington, North Carolina provides an experiment. Several years ago, a chemical called Gen X was found in the river that's the water supply for much of the region. So what economists did is they looked at that and they said, this is like a natural experiment. Let's see what happens to the price of homes that receive their water from that source versus those that don't. Before the announcement was made that this had been found, everybody assumed the water was the same everywhere. Afterwards, now we've got a natural experiment. That's what economists are looking for. So economists as social scientists are trying to understand the world around them, the social world, people's behavior. And one of the big challenges they face is that they can't run experiments, but they use theory and existing data to try and gain insights. So to make sense of all of this, their models are based on assumptions to try and make them simple enough that we can wrap our minds around them. And then the economists use those insights to make forecasts, policy recommendations, and explain behavior. Hopefully you're getting an idea of what it's like to think like an economist, and you'll be a professional people watcher soon. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.